The iron gates of Hawthorne Ridge opened with the silent obedience of a kingdom that knew its ruler. Beyond them, the Westchester estate rose from the snow-dusted hill like a private world, stone, glass, and warm amber lights that made night feel optional. Ethan Caldwell sat in the back seat of his black sedan, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles looked carved from marble. The driver's voice faded into background noise as the estate came into view. "Mr. Caldwell, we're home." Home. The word had once meant laughter, weekend pancakes, and children racing down hallways. Now it meant quiet ramps where stairs used to be, padded corners, therapy mats, and the constant aching awareness that no amount of money could purchase the one thing Ethan wanted most. A miracle. The car rolled to a stop beneath the covered driveway. A line of staff waited, house manager, chef, 2 security men, and a nurse. They all wore expressions that said the same thing: careful, considerate, controlled. As if a sudden movement might shatter the world. Ethan stepped out into the cold and inhaled air that smelled like pine and snow. He adjusted his wool coat, glanced at the mansion's tall windows, and felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Inside those walls were his sons. 2 little boys with the same storm-gray eyes as his own. 2 beautiful children who had been born into wealth and safety, yet trapped inside bodies that refused to cooperate. The doctors used soft language. Delayed mobility. Neurological uncertainty. Developmental complications. Ethan heard only one sentence. They can't walk. And every day he watched them try. He walked inside, greeted by warmth and polished marble floors that reflected the chandelier overhead. The house manager, Margaret, approached immediately. "Mr. Caldwell," she said gently. "The boys had physical therapy this afternoon. They're resting now. Did Dr. Chen say anything new?" Margaret's expression flickered just enough for Ethan to catch it. "Nothing definite. She suggested continuing the program. Consistency." Consistency was another word for time. Time was another word for waiting. Waiting was something Ethan Caldwell had never been trained to do. He removed his coat and handed it off. "Where's Veronica?" Margaret hesitated. "She went into the city. She said she'd be back late." Ethan's jaw tightened. Veronica Caldwell was his wife on paper and a ghost in practice. Since the twins' diagnosis, she had seemed to drift farther away, as if the reality of their sons had rewritten her understanding of life in a way she couldn't accept. At first, she cried. Then she raged. Then she disappeared. Ethan stopped asking where she went. The answers always hurt more than the silence. He walked past the grand staircase, unused now because the nursery had been moved to the first floor. Every accommodation had been installed by the best architects and medical specialists. The estate had transformed into a high-end rehabilitation center disguised as a home. He entered the nursery suite and found the nurse, Clara, sitting near the window with a tablet. "They're asleep," Clara whispered. Ethan approached the twin beds. The boys lay on their backs beneath soft blue blankets. Liam's lips were slightly parted, his lashes resting against his cheeks. Noah curled his tiny fingers around the edge of his blanket like he was holding onto something invisible. They looked peaceful like this, like ordinary children. But Ethan knew how fragile that peace was. He knew the silent frustration that lived behind their eyes when their legs didn't respond the way their minds demanded. He lowered himself into the chair between their beds and stayed there, listening to the soft rhythm of their breathing. This was the only place he didn't feel like a billionaire. Here, he was just a father. A man who would trade every penthouse, every stock share, every award and headline, just to see his son stand up and take one step. His phone buzzed. A message from Margaret. Candidate arrived. Waiting in the study. Ethan stared at the screen for a moment, then exhaled. Right. The new hire. They had gone through 5 caregivers in 6 months. Some were too rough, some too nervous, some too distracted by the size of the house and the quiet power of the Caldwell name. One had tried to photograph the nursery for a gossip site. Ethan had fired her on the spot. This one, Margaret said, was different. A woman named Grace Harper. Recommended by a pediatric physical therapist in Manhattan. Background clean. References solid. A calm voice on the phone. No interest in the Caldwell spotlight. Ethan didn't believe in different anymore. But he would keep trying until he ran out of breath. He stood, brushed a kiss over each boy's forehead, and left the nursery. The study was at the far end of the main floor, tucked behind a corridor of framed photographs. Ethan rarely looked at them now. They captured a version of his life that didn't exist anymore. He pushed open the double doors. Grace Harper stood near the fireplace, hands clasped in front of her. She wasn't dressed like the other applicants had been, no stiff blazer or high heels. She wore a simple dark sweater, black slacks, and flat shoes. Her brown hair was pulled back neatly, and her face was calm in a way that made Ethan uncomfortable. Too steady. Too composed. She turned when she heard him enter. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. Her voice was warm, clear, unshaken. Not overly polite. Not forced. Ethan nodded once. "Ms. Harper." Grace's eyes met his without challenge, but without submission either. They were an honest hazel, like the kind of eyes that had seen hardship and learned not to flinch. Margaret stood beside Ethan, holding a folder. "Grace has already completed the paperwork and orientation. If you'd like, she can begin tomorrow morning." Ethan didn't sit. He remained standing, like a man interviewing a stranger who might be allowed near his heart. "Why do you want this job?" he asked. Grace didn't blink. "Because I'm good at it. And because your sons deserve someone who believes progress is possible." Ethan's throat tightened slightly. He hated the word possible. It had betrayed him too many times. "And what makes you think you're different from the last 5 people who said the same thing?" he asked, sharper than he intended. Grace's gaze softened. Not pity, not fear. Understanding. "I'm not here for your money or your name," she said. "I'm here for Liam and Noah. And I don't measure progress the way most people do." Ethan crossed his arms. "Explain." Grace took a breath. Sometimes a child's body doesn't respond because they're afraid. Sometimes it's pain. Sometimes it's neurological. But fear can lock the body too. I work with trust first. Movement comes later. Ethan stared at her, studying her as if he could read her like a contract. "You're not a doctor." "No," Grace agreed. "But I've worked beside them. And I've helped children who were told they'd never do certain things. Not by forcing them. By listening to them." Ethan felt the familiar bitterness rise. "And what exactly do you think you can do for my sons that the best specialists in the country couldn't?" Grace didn't flinch at his tone. "I can be consistent. I can be present. And I can treat them like children, not projects." Silence settled between them. Ethan looked away briefly, toward the fire, and saw his reflection in the polished glass of the bookcase. A tall man in a tailored suit with eyes that looked older than his years. He turned back. "You'll have strict boundaries. No photos. No media. No visitors. No discussing the family with anyone. Ever." Grace nodded. "Understood. And if you can't handle the emotional weight of this job, leave before you break them." Grace's voice remained steady. "I won't break them." For the first time in months, Ethan felt something strange. Not hope. Not relief. Something closer to curiosity. He glanced at Margaret. "Show her the nursery tomorrow at 7. Margaret smiled faintly. "Of course." Grace gave a small nod and reached for her bag. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell." Ethan didn't say you're welcome. He wasn't ready to offer kindness like that. Kindness had become dangerous. It made you believe. Grace headed toward the door, then paused as if she remembered something. "One more thing," she said softly. Ethan looked up. Grace's gaze held his. "I know you've been trying to buy a miracle. But miracles don't usually respond to pressure. Sometimes they respond to patience." Ethan's chest tightened again. He wanted to reject her words, to crush them the way he crushed doubt in boardrooms. But this wasn't a boardroom. This was his son's. Grace left the study quietly, her footsteps fading down the hall. Ethan stood alone by the fire, staring at the space she had occupied. Outside, snow began to fall again, coating Hawthorne Ridge in white silence. And upstairs, behind ramps and padded corners, two little boys slept, unaware that tomorrow morning a stranger would enter their world. A stranger who, for reasons Ethan didn't yet understand, spoke like someone who didn't fear broken things. Ethan Caldwell had built an empire by believing everything could be controlled. But as he turned and walked back toward the nursery, one truth followed him like a shadow. Some things could not be controlled. Some things had to be healed. And he didn't know if his heart could survive one more disappointment. Not when the stakes were Liam and Noah. Not when tomorrow was coming. Morning arrived at Hawthorne Ridge without announcement. No alarms rang, no hurried footsteps echoed down the halls. The house woke the way it always did, slowly, carefully, as if sound itself might bruise something fragile. Grace Harper arrived at exactly 6:58. The security gate scanned her ID, cameras following as her modest gray sedan rolled up the long drive. She parked where Margaret had instructed, smoothed her sweater, and sat still for a moment with her hands resting on the steering wheel. Not nerves, she told herself. Focus. She stepped into the cold and felt it sharpen her senses. The mansion loomed ahead, impressive but not intimidating, not to her. She had worked in places like this before. Wealth changed architecture, not humanity. Inside, Margaret greeted her with a quiet smile. "Good morning, Grace. Thank you for being punctual." "I believe children notice consistency," Grace replied gently. Margaret seemed to approve of that. She handed Grace a badge and gestured down the hall. "Mr. Caldwell is already awake. He likes to observe, from a distance." Grace nodded. "That's fine." They walked together toward the nursery suite. The hallway lighting was soft, deliberately warm. Grace noticed the ramps integrated into the floors, the widened doorways, the subtle absence of sharp edges. This house had been redesigned around two small bodies. Margaret stopped outside the nursery doors. "I'll leave you here. The boys usually wake around 7:15. Clara, the nurse, will join you shortly." Grace inhaled once, centered herself, and pushed the door open. The room was quiet, washed in pale morning light filtering through sheer curtains. Two small beds sat side by side, identical in every way except the children within them. Liam stirred first, his brow furrowing slightly as if the world had called his name too early. Noah followed moments later, blinking slowly, his eyes unfocused until they found the ceiling. Grace didn't speak right away. She moved carefully, deliberately, letting the boys register her presence without intrusion. She knelt near the foot of the beds, placing herself at their eye level rather than towering over them. "Good morning," she said softly. Liam turned his head toward her voice. His eyes were alert, cautious. Noah watched too, fingers curling against the mattress. Grace smiled, not wide, not exaggerated. "Just enough. My name is Grace," she continued. "I'll be spending some mornings with you." She waited. Children like these, she knew, were used to being talked at. Instructions. Encouragement. Commands disguised as kindness. She had learned long ago that silence could be more respectful than words. Noah made a small sound, something between a hum and a question. Grace nodded. "Yeah. Mornings can be strange." That earned her a blink. A longer look. Behind the partially open door, Ethan Caldwell stood still. He had woken before dawn, unable to quiet his mind. From the hallway, he watched the scene unfold through the narrow gap, arms folded, his posture rigid with skepticism. Grace didn't rush. She didn't reach for the boys. She didn't adjust their blankets or call for the nurse. She simply existed in the room with them. Ethan frowned. After a minute, Grace stood and moved toward the window, adjusting the curtains just enough to let sunlight spill gently across the floor. "Do you like light?" she asked casually. "Or do you prefer it dim?" Liam's gaze followed the movement of the curtain. His eyes narrowed slightly, not discomfort, but focus. Grace noticed. "Okay," she said. A little light. She returned to the boys and sat cross-legged on the floor between the beds. She pulled a small object from her bag, a soft fabric ribbon, deep blue, textured but flexible. Ethan leaned forward slightly. What is she doing? Grace rolled the ribbon between her fingers, letting it catch the light. She didn't wave it or shake it. She simply let it be seen. Noah's fingers twitched. Grace noticed that too. She slowly extended the ribbon toward him, stopping several inches short of his hand. "You don't have to touch it," she said calmly. "It's just here." Noah stared. His hand lifted a fraction, then dropped back to the bed. Grace didn't react. Seconds passed. Then, almost imperceptibly, Noah's fingers reached again, this time brushing the ribbon's edge. Grace smiled softly. "There you go." Behind the door, Ethan's breath caught. It wasn't the movement itself. It was the absence of pressure. No cheering. No urging. No forced celebration. Just acknowledgement. Liam shifted, watching his brother intently. His legs moved slightly beneath the blanket, not coordinated, not purposeful, but reactive. Grace turned her attention to him without comment. She adjusted her position so the ribbon rested closer to his side too. "You can look," she said. "That's enough." Liam's eyes followed the fabric, his jaw tightening with concentration. Ethan felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Clara, the nurse, entered quietly and froze when she saw Grace on the floor. "Oh, should I?" Grace glanced up. "You're fine. Just stay nearby." Clara obeyed, uncertain but curious. Minutes passed in gentle stillness. The boys remained awake, engaged, alert in a way Ethan rarely saw outside therapy sessions. Eventually, Grace stood. "Breakfast comes next," she said. "But we'll take our time." She turned toward the door and finally noticed Ethan standing there. Their eyes met. Grace didn't look startled. She didn't look defensive. She simply nodded, acknowledging him as part of the room rather than an authority looming above it. Ethan stepped inside. "They usually eat in their chairs," he said quietly. Grace nodded. "That's fine. I just wanted them awake first." He studied her. "You didn't do any exercises." "No," she agreed. "Why?" Grace considered him for a moment. "Because today isn't about strength. It's about safety." Ethan frowned. "Safety. They need to trust the space before they challenge their bodies," she said. "Otherwise every movement feels like a risk." He looked at his sons. They were calmer than usual. More present. "You think fear is holding them back," Ethan said. "I think fear is part of it," Grace replied. "And fear doesn't respond to force." Ethan didn't argue. He couldn't. He had tried force, money, pressure, endless appointments. None of it had worked. Breakfast was quiet. Grace fed the boys slowly, narrating nothing, allowing them to set the pace. When Liam struggled with a swallow, she paused without panic. When Noah dropped his spoon, she handed it back without comment. Ethan watched it all. Hours later, as Grace prepared to leave for the day, Ethan stopped her in the hallway. "You didn't follow the therapy schedule," he said. Grace met his gaze calmly. "I didn't violate it either." "That wasn't an answer." She nodded. "Then here's one. If I follow every rule exactly as written, I'll get the same results you've already gotten." The words landed harder than she likely intended. Ethan stared at her. "And what results are those?" he asked quietly. Grace hesitated just a fraction. "Frustration. And exhaustion." Silence filled the corridor. Finally, Ethan exhaled. "You'll continue tomorrow." Grace nodded. "Thank you." As she walked away, Ethan remained where he was, listening to the sounds of his house. For the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt attentive. Upstairs, Liam shifted in his chair, his foot pressing faintly, but deliberately, against the support beneath it. No one noticed. Not yet. But something had begun. By the third morning, Ethan Caldwell told himself he was no longer watching. That was the lie he repeated while standing in the shadowed hallway outside the nursery, coffee cooling in his hand as he observed Grace Harper through the half-open door. He wasn't watching, he reasoned. He was simply aware. A man should be aware of what happened inside his own house. Grace arrived at the same time every day. She wore the same calm expression, the same practical clothes, the same quiet confidence that unsettled him more than any grand promise ever had. She greeted the boys the same way too, not with exaggerated cheer, but with steady warmth, like someone returning to a place she belonged. "Good morning, Liam," she said softly. "Good morning, Noah." The boys responded now. Not with words, not with the kind of movement doctors measured on charts, but with recognition. Liam's eyes followed her the moment she entered. Noah's fingers twitched in anticipation. Ethan noticed that. He told himself it meant nothing. Children adapted. They adjusted. It didn't mean progress. Grace knelt beside Noah's bed and rested her forearms on the mattress, placing herself close but not touching. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, more to the moment than to the child. Noah made a low sound in his throat. Grace smiled slightly, as if he'd answered. "That sounds about right." She turned her attention to Liam next, adjusting the blanket that had slipped during the night. Her movements were slow, deliberate, like she was asking permission with every gesture. Ethan shifted his weight. The therapists had been trained professionals, certified, licensed, impressive on paper. But they had moved with purpose, not patience. They had always been chasing results. Grace wasn't chasing anything. After breakfast, she surprised Ethan by not heading toward the therapy room. "Where are you taking them?" he asked as she wheeled the boys toward the sunroom. "Somewhere quieter," she replied. "The therapy room is designed for their needs." "So is silence," Grace said gently. Ethan frowned but followed at a distance. The sunroom was flooded with soft light, the glass walls revealing snow-covered trees and a frozen pond beyond. Grace positioned the boys so they could see outside, then sat on the floor between them. She said nothing. Minutes passed. Ethan's patience thinned. "You can't just let them sit there." Grace glanced over her shoulder. "I'm not letting them sit. I'm letting them observe." Liam's gaze had locked onto something beyond the glass, a cardinal perched on a branch, its red feathers vivid against the white landscape. Grace noticed. "Do you see it?" she asked quietly. Liam's chest rose with a shallow breath. His fingers curled. Grace leaned closer. "It's bright, isn't it?" The bird fluttered, hopping along the branch. Liam's leg jerked, not randomly, but in response. A small movement, barely there, but intentional. Ethan stiffened. Grace did not react. She didn't cheer. She didn't point. She didn't draw attention to the movement. She simply stayed still. The bird flew away moments later, and Liam's body relaxed. Grace nodded once, as if filing something away. "That's enough for now," she said softly. Ethan felt a strange mix of frustration and unease. "You saw that, didn't you?" Grace looked up at him. "I did. And you're not going to document it?" "Not yet." "Why not?" "Because if I turn it into an event, it becomes pressure. Pressure turns curiosity into fear." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "You're saying my sons are afraid of moving." "I'm saying they've learned that movement comes with expectations," Grace replied. "And expectations can feel like traps." That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay awake in the master bedroom, staring at the ceiling, replaying the image of Liam's leg responding to the bird's flight. He had seen dozens of specialists' coax movements that looked similar, but those had been forced, prompted by commands and counting. This had been different. Natural. Uninvited. It terrified him. The next afternoon, Ethan had a meeting downtown and left the estate earlier than usual. He didn't tell Grace. He didn't announce his departure. He simply left. What he didn't know was that Grace had planned something small for that window of time. After lunch, she wheeled the boys into the playroom, a space rarely used because therapists preferred controlled environments. The room held shelves of untouched toys, donated equipment, and bright mats arranged with clinical precision. Grace ignored most of it. She removed her shoes, then helped the boys out of their chairs and onto the mat, not to sit upright, not to practice posture, but to lie comfortably on their backs. "This is just rest," she said. "Nothing else." She lay down too, parallel to them, her arms stretched out comfortably. The boys watched her. Grace hummed softly. No melody, just vibration. Noah's head turned toward the sound. Grace shifted slightly closer, humming lower now, letting the vibration resonate through the mat. Noah's leg moved. It wasn't a kick. It wasn't a stretch. It was a push. His heel pressed into the mat, creating resistance. Grace felt it. Her breath caught, but she didn't stop humming. She didn't touch him. She didn't react at all. Noah's leg pressed again. Harder. Grace kept humming. After a moment, Liam's foot brushed the mat too, his knee bending slightly. Grace's eyes stung. Not because this was the miracle Ethan was waiting for, but because this was something quieter, more fragile. Initiation. When Ethan returned unexpectedly an hour later, the house was silent. He walked through the corridor toward the playroom, intending to check on the boys before heading to his study. He stopped when he heard the sound. A hum. Low. Steady. Almost imperceptible. He stepped closer. Through the open doorway, he saw Grace lying on the floor beside his sons. Not directing them. Not instructing them. Simply existing with them. And then he saw it. Noah's heel pressed against the mat again, deliberate, slow. Liam's knee bent, his foot sliding just a fraction. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. Grace still hadn't reacted. Ethan couldn't hold it in. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice sharper than he meant. Grace froze, not in fear, but in awareness. She slowly sat up, careful not to startle the boys. "Resting," she said calmly. "They're moving," Ethan said, stepping into the room. "They're moving, Grace." She nodded. "Yes. And you didn't tell anyone?" "No." Ethan's hands trembled. "Why?" Grace looked at him fully now. "Because this moment doesn't belong to you." The words cut deep. Ethan opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. Grace continued, gently but firmly. "If you rush in with excitement or fear, they'll feel it. And they'll stop. This isn't a performance. It's a conversation their bodies are having with the world." Ethan looked down at his sons. They were calm, focused, present. "I've spent millions trying to make this happen," he said hoarsely. Grace softened. "I know. And you're telling me I have to do nothing?" "I'm telling you," she said quietly, "that sometimes the most powerful thing a parent can do is not interrupt." Ethan swallowed hard. For the first time since the boys were born, he realized something terrifying. Progress had been happening in his house. And he almost missed it, because he'd been looking too hard. Behind them, Noah pressed his heel into the mat once more. This time, Ethan saw it. And this time, he didn't speak. Ethan Caldwell had always believed that control was a form of love. You protected what you loved by surrounding it with structure, rules, schedules, experts, safeguards. That belief had built his empire. It had kept him alive in ruthless boardrooms and merciless negotiations. It had also shaped the way he loved his sons. But that belief was beginning to crack. The morning after Ethan witnessed the movement in the playroom, the house felt different. Not brighter. Not louder. Just alert. As if every wall and window were holding its breath. Grace arrived at 6:58, as always. Ethan didn't hide in the hallway this time. He waited in the nursery, standing near the window, hands in his pockets, trying, and failing, to look casual. Grace entered, greeted the boys, then paused when she noticed Ethan. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," he replied. There was something fragile in his voice that hadn't been there before. Grace knelt beside Liam's bed, smoothing the blanket, then glanced back at Ethan. "Do you want to stay?" The question caught him off guard. "Is that allowed?" he asked. Grace smiled faintly. "You're their father. You're always allowed. The question is whether you can stay without directing." Ethan exhaled slowly. "I'll try." Grace nodded once. "That's all I ask." She went about the morning routine with the same unhurried rhythm, no sudden movements, no unnecessary words. Ethan stayed back, leaning against the wall, watching himself as much as her. When Noah grew fussy during breakfast, Ethan instinctively stepped forward. Maybe he needs Grace raised a hand gently, not stopping him, just pausing the moment. "Let's wait 10 seconds," she said. Ethan clenched his jaw but obeyed. Noah's fussing slowed. His breathing steadied. He reached clumsily for the edge of the tray himself. Grace nodded. There it is. Ethan felt something twist inside him. How many moments like this had he stolen from his sons without realizing it? Later that morning, Margaret approached Ethan with a clipboard. "Mr. Caldwell, Dr. Chen called. She'd like to schedule a reassessment this week." Ethan hesitated. Normally, he would have agreed immediately. Instead, he looked toward the sunroom, where Grace sat with the boys, reading quietly while they watched shadows move across the floor. "Not yet," he said. Margaret blinked. "Sir, give it another week." Margaret nodded, though confusion flickered across her face. Ethan knew what he was doing was dangerous. Doctors liked data, timelines, charts. Grace was offering none of that. Only moments, small, undocumented, easily dismissed. And yet, that afternoon, something happened that Grace had not planned for. Veronica came home. Her heels echoed sharply against the marble floors, her presence announced by the scent of expensive perfume and winter air. She swept into the living room, coat still on, eyes scanning the space like she was visiting a hotel rather than returning to her family. "Where are the boys?" she asked, not bothering with a greeting. "In the sunroom," Ethan replied from the study doorway. Veronica turned toward him, her perfectly shaped brows drawing together. "With who?" "With Grace." Her mouth tightened. "The new maid." "Caregiver," Ethan corrected. Veronica scoffed. "I don't care what you call her." She walked briskly toward the sunroom before Ethan could stop her. Grace heard the heels first. She looked up as Veronica entered, her posture stiff, her eyes sharp and assessing. Grace rose smoothly to her feet. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said politely. Veronica didn't return the greeting. Her gaze went straight to the boys, then to the mat on the floor, the toys untouched. "What is this?" Veronica demanded. "Why are they on the floor?" Grace kept her voice calm. "They were comfortable." "They're not supposed to be on the floor," Veronica snapped. "They need proper positioning." Grace nodded slowly. "They were supported, and they initiated the movement themselves." Veronica laughed, short, humorless. "Movement? You think this is movement?" Ethan entered the room then. "Veronica, stop." She turned on him. "You're letting a maid experiment on our children?" Grace stiffened, but only slightly. "I'm not experimenting," she said. "I'm responding." Veronica ignored her. "We have doctors for this. Therapists. People with credentials." Grace met Veronica's gaze steadily. "I work alongside those people. But your sons are not machines. They don't respond well to force." Veronica's face flushed. "You don't get to tell me what my sons respond to." The boys sensed the shift immediately. Noah's breathing quickened. Liam's fingers curled tightly into his blanket. Grace noticed. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said softly, "they're getting overwhelmed." Veronica crossed her arms. "Then maybe you should put them back in their chairs where they belong." Grace didn't move. Ethan stepped forward. "Veronica, you're upsetting them." She stared at him like he'd betrayed her. "I'm their mother." "And right now," Ethan said quietly, "you're scaring them." The room fell silent. Grace lowered herself slowly to the floor again, placing herself between the boys, not blocking Veronica, but grounding the space. "It's okay," she murmured to the children. "Nothing bad is happening." She hummed. "Low. Steady." Noah's breathing eased slightly. Liam's eyes remained wide but focused on Grace's face. Veronica watched, unsettled. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Regulating," Grace replied simply. Veronica turned back to Ethan. "This is insane. You're choosing her over me." Ethan didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was steady but tired. "I'm choosing what helps our sons." Veronica's eyes glistened, not with tears, but with fury. "You think I don't want to help them?" "I think," Ethan said carefully, That you're trying to escape how helpless this makes you feel." That struck. Veronica recoiled like he'd slapped her. "You don't get to psychoanalyze me." "No," he agreed. "But I get to protect them." She laughed bitterly. "From their own mother." Grace rose again, her voice gentle but firm. "Mrs. Caldwell, I'm not replacing you. I'm not crossing any lines. But if you raise your voice around them, their bodies will shut down. I've seen it happen." Veronica stared at her, then at the boys. For a moment, just one, something cracked. Her shoulders slumped slightly. "They weren't supposed to be like this," she whispered. The words hung heavy in the air. Grace softened immediately. "No," she said. "They weren't. And neither were you." Veronica swallowed hard, then turned abruptly and walked out of the room. The house felt colder after she left. Ethan exhaled shakily. "I'm sorry." Grace shook her head. "This was always going to happen." "What?" he asked. "The moment someone challenges the story you've been telling yourself about control," Grace said quietly. "It feels like an attack." Ethan looked down at his sons. They were calm again. Present. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. Grace met his gaze. "You're learning." That evening, Ethan sat alone in the study long after the house went quiet. For the first time, he understood something clearly. Grace hadn't crossed a line. She had revealed one. And once you saw it, you couldn't pretend it wasn't there. Upstairs, in the nursery, Liam shifted in his sleep, his leg bending just slightly before relaxing again. No one saw it. But it happened. And it mattered. The days that followed felt suspended in time, as if Hawthorne Ridge had slipped into a narrow space between what had been and what might be. Veronica did not return to the sunroom. She stayed in the west wing, doors closed, phone calls murmured behind heavy wood. Ethan did not force her back into the routine. For once, he chose not to force anything. Grace noticed the change immediately. Not the absence of Veronica, that kind of distance had a shape she recognized, but the way Ethan moved through the house. Slower. More deliberate. As if every step required a decision. On Wednesday morning, Grace found Ethan already sitting on the floor of the playroom when she arrived, his suit jacket folded neatly beside him. He looked uncomfortable, like a man who had taken off armor without knowing how to stand without it. "You don't have to sit there," Grace said gently. "I know," he replied. "But I want to." She nodded and went to greet the boys. Liam watched his father carefully, his gaze sharp and searching. Noah's eyes flicked between Grace and Ethan, uncertain but curious. Grace knelt. "Your dad is joining us today," she said calmly. "That's okay." Ethan swallowed. He didn't reach for them. He didn't speak. He simply sat. Grace began the morning as she always did. Soft voice, slow movements, no agenda announced. She brought out a textured ball this time, placing it on the mat between the boys, not pushing it toward them. Liam stared at it. Noah shifted slightly. Grace leaned back on her hands and waited. Minutes passed. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to help, to intervene, to guide. He clenched his hands together to keep them still. Noah's fingers twitched. He reached, hesitated, then brushed the ball. It rolled an inch. Grace smiled faintly but said nothing. Liam watched the movement intently. His brow furrowed with concentration. Slowly, carefully, his leg bent at the knee, his foot dragging against the mat as if searching for traction. Ethan felt his breath hitch. The foot pressed down. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't strong. But it was deliberate. Grace stayed still. Ethan stayed still. The room held its breath. Liam pressed again, his heel digging into the mat, creating resistance. His body tensed, then relaxed. A quiet sound escaped his throat, not frustration, not pain. Something closer to surprise. Grace spoke softly. "You felt that." Liam's eyes flicked to her face. Ethan felt tears burn behind his eyes. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, celebrated it in fantasies filled with applause and relief. But this was nothing like that. This was quiet, private, sacred. Later that day, Grace asked Ethan to walk with her through the grounds while the boys napped. They moved along the cleared path beside the frozen pond, the air sharp and clean. "You're holding back," Grace said gently. Ethan let out a short laugh. "I'm trying not to ruin it." She smiled. "That fear is understandable. But they don't need perfection from you. They need presence." He stopped walking, staring out across the ice. "I don't know how to be present without trying to fix things." Grace turned to face him fully. "Then start by noticing when you're trying to fix your own discomfort instead of theirs." The words landed heavier than he expected. "You think that's what I've been doing?" he asked quietly. "I think you've been trying to outrun grief," Grace said. "And grief always catches up." Ethan looked down at his hands. "I was supposed to give them everything." "You are," Grace said. "Just not the way you planned." That evening, Ethan did something he hadn't done in months. He carried Liam from the nursery to the window overlooking the grounds. Not to reposition him. Not to stretch him. Just to stand together. Liam rested against his chest, his head tucked beneath Ethan's chin. Ethan felt the warmth of his son's body, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "You're okay," Ethan whispered. "You don't have to do anything." Liam shifted slightly. His leg pressed against Ethan's hip, firm, intentional. Ethan froze. Then he relaxed, adjusting his stance without comment. Liam pressed again. Ethan laughed softly through tears. "I feel it, buddy." In the nursery doorway, Grace watched without interrupting. 2 days later, Dr. Chen arrived. Ethan hadn't planned to call her yet, but Margaret had insisted. "She's concerned about the lack of updates." Grace didn't object. Dr. Chen entered the playroom with her tablet and professional composure, eyes scanning the room for data points. "Good morning," she said. "How have things been progressing?" Ethan hesitated. Grace answered. "Quietly." Dr. Chen frowned slightly. "Quiet progress is still progress. Do you have documentation?" Grace shook her head. "Not the kind you're asking for." Dr. Chen turned to Ethan. "Mr. Caldwell?" Ethan took a breath. "I want you to observe." Grace positioned the boys on the mat, just as she always did. No special setup. No cues. They waited. Noah shifted first, pushing his heel into the mat. Liam followed, his knee bending, foot pressing, body adjusting. Dr. Chen's eyes widened. "Again," she whispered, almost afraid to break the moment. The boys moved again. Dr. Chen covered her mouth, then quickly lowered her hand, composing herself. "This is self-initiated." Grace nodded. "Yes." "How long has this been happening?" Dr. Chen asked. Ethan answered quietly. "Longer than I realized." Dr. Chen looked at Grace with new respect. "What exactly are you doing?" Grace met her gaze calmly. "Listening." That night, Veronica returned to the nursery for the first time in weeks. She stood in the doorway, uncertain, watching Ethan sit on the floor with the boys. "Can I come in?" she asked softly. Ethan nodded. She approached slowly, kneeling beside them. Her hands trembled as she brushed Noah's hair back. "I didn't know how to stay," she whispered. "Every time I tried, it hurt too much." Grace gave her space. Noah shifted, his foot pressing against the mat. Veronica gasped. "Did you see that?" Ethan smiled gently. "Yes." Tears streamed down Veronica's face. She pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed. "They're trying," she sobbed. "They always were," Grace said quietly. "They just needed time to feel safe enough." Later, as Grace prepared to leave, Veronica stopped her. "Thank you," she said, voice raw, "for not giving up on them. Or us." Grace nodded. "This isn't over." "I know," Veronica said. "But for the first time, it feels possible." Grace stepped out into the cold evening air, her breath fogging in front of her. Behind her, Hawthorne Ridge glowed softly against the dark. Inside, 2 little boys slept, muscles tired, bodies learning, minds quietly brave. And for the first time since their birth, the house was not waiting for a miracle. It was witnessing one, moment by moment. Progress, Ethan learned, did not arrive like a door thrown open. It crept in quietly, carrying weight. The morning after Dr. Chen's visit, Hawthorne Ridge buzzed with a low, restless energy. Not excitement, something more cautious. As if everyone in the house had collectively agreed not to speak too loudly in case they frightened the fragile thing unfolding. Grace arrived at her usual time and immediately sensed it. "Too many eyes," she murmured to Ethan as they stood near the kitchen doorway, watching Margaret whisper to a staff member. "I didn't tell them to watch," Ethan said. "I know," Grace replied. "Hope does that on its own." They moved the boys to the sunroom as planned. Liam seemed alert, his gaze sharper than usual. Noah was quieter, his brow faintly furrowed, as if processing 1,000 invisible calculations. Grace knelt beside them. "Today might feel heavier," she said softly. "That's okay." Ethan frowned. "Heavier?" Grace nodded. "Forward movement isn't light. It asks the body to do work it's never done before." As if understanding, Noah's foot pressed into the mat once, hesitant, uncertain, then stilled. Grace didn't fill the silence. Minutes passed. Ethan's chest tightened. He recognized this feeling, the fear that something had gone wrong, that yesterday's progress had been a fluke. His instinct to intervene surged like a reflex. Grace felt it without looking. "Let it be hard," she said quietly. Noah exhaled sharply, his breath puffing out in frustration. His leg trembled slightly. Grace leaned back just enough for him to see her face. "Hard doesn't mean bad." Noah's heel pressed again, longer this time. His knee bent, foot dragging, muscles visibly engaging. Ethan's breath stuttered. Liam watched his brother intensely, his body responding in sympathy. His leg shifted, foot pushing, knee lifting higher than it ever had before. But then, too much. Liam cried out, a sharp sound of overload rather than pain. His body stiffened, muscles locking. Ethan surged forward. Grace raised a hand. "Wait." Ethan froze, every nerve screaming. Grace lowered herself beside Liam, not touching him yet. "I'm here," she said calmly. "Nothing is wrong." Liam's breathing was fast, shallow. Grace hummed, low and steady. Seconds stretched. Liam's shoulders loosened. His breathing slowed. His body softened against the mat. Grace gently placed her hand beside his leg, not on it, just near. "You did a lot," she said. "That's enough for today." Ethan sagged back onto his heels, trembling. "I thought we'd lost it," he admitted hoarsely. Grace shook her head. "No. This is part of it." "Part of what?" "Learning that effort doesn't end in harm," she said. "Their bodies are learning trust the same way their minds are." Later that afternoon, Ethan sat alone in the study with a legal pad filled with half-written notes he couldn't focus on. For the first time in years, business felt distant, irrelevant. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Veronica stepped in, hesitating. "Can we talk?" she asked. He nodded. She sat across from him, twisting her fingers together. "I'm scared." Ethan didn't interrupt. "I'm scared that if I hope too much, it'll disappear," she continued. "And I don't know how to survive that again." Ethan swallowed. "I know." She looked up, eyes red. "You seem so calm." "I'm not," he said honestly. "I'm just learning to sit with it." Veronica laughed weakly. "I don't know how." Ethan thought of Grace's words. "Let it be hard." "Maybe you don't have to know how," he said. "Maybe you just stay." That evening, Grace found Veronica alone in the nursery, sitting beside Noah's bed. "Can I sit?" Grace asked gently. Veronica nodded. They sat in silence for a long moment. "I used to think if I tried hard enough, I could make this go away," Veronica whispered. "Like it was something I could outwork." Grace shook her head softly. "This isn't something to defeat." Veronica closed her eyes. "I hate that I can't fix it." Grace met her gaze. "You don't have to fix your children to love them well." Tears slid down Veronica's cheeks. "I don't know if I know how to love them like this." Grace placed a hand over her own heart. "You're learning. That counts." 2 days later, the breakthrough came wrapped in struggle. Grace had taken the boys into the small indoor garden, a space rarely used, filled with low plants and warm light. The scent of soil and greenery filled the air. Liam was restless. Noah seemed withdrawn. Grace sensed resistance, not fear, but fatigue. "We can stop," Ethan offered. Grace shook her head. "Let's change the question." She knelt near the boys and placed her palm flat on the ground. "What does the floor feel like?" Noah looked down. His fingers brushed the surface. Grace pressed her palm gently into the ground. "It holds you." Noah stared. Grace waited. Noah leaned, just a fraction, his weight shifting forward. His foot pressed, knee bent, his body tipping into the effort. His hands slapped the ground. Not gracefully, not smoothly, but intentionally. Ethan gasped. Noah froze, startled by his own success. Grace leaned closer. "You caught yourself." Noah's breath hitched. Then, slowly, he shifted again, weight transferring. He wasn't standing, but he was supporting himself. Liam cried out, frustrated, watching his brother. Grace turned to him. "Your turn will come. Not today. But it will come." Liam's foot pressed hard against the mat, harder than ever before. Ethan dropped to his knees, unable to stay upright. "I'm here," he whispered, though no one had asked. That night, the house didn't sleep. Not from noise, but from awareness. Ethan lay awake, replaying Noah's hands hitting the ground, the look of shock on his son's face as he realized what he'd done. It wasn't walking, but it was forward. And forward, Ethan understood now, was heavy. It demanded patience. It demanded humility. It demanded the willingness to live without guarantees. In the quiet hours before dawn, Ethan made a decision. Not about therapy schedules. Not about doctors or plans. But about himself. He would stop treating progress like a finish line. He would stop chasing the version of his sons he had imagined, and start honoring the ones in front of him. Upstairs, Noah shifted in his sleep, his leg bending unconsciously before relaxing again. Liam mirrored the movement a moment later. Their bodies remembered. And somewhere in the stillness of Hawthorne Ridge, the future leaned forward, slow, unsteady, but undeniably alive. The problem with miracles, even the quiet ones, is that they attract attention. Ethan should have known it wouldn't stay contained inside the walls of Hawthorne Ridge. Progress had a way of leaking out through changed schedules, canceled appointments, whispered conversations between staff who were no longer pretending nothing was happening. By Friday morning, the pressure arrived wearing a polite smile. Margaret approached Ethan in the study, her clipboard clutched a little too tightly. "Mr. Caldwell, there's been an inquiry." Ethan didn't look up from the window. "From who?" "A foundation. One you donate to. They heard about the boys' developments." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Heard from where?" Margaret hesitated. Dr. Chen mentioned something in confidence to a colleague. "It traveled." Ethan exhaled sharply. He didn't blame Dr. Chen, hope loosened tongues, but the consequences were the same. "What do they want?" he asked. "They'd like to observe," Margaret said. "Possibly document." "No," Ethan said immediately. Margaret nodded, relieved. "I'll tell them." But the world was already closer than Ethan realized. That morning, Grace sensed it before anyone spoke a word. Liam was restless, his movements jerky rather than exploratory. Noah's focus scattered, his attention flicking to every sound in the hallway. "Too much," Grace murmured. Ethan knelt beside her. "I'll clear the house." Grace shook her head. "It's not just the house. It's the energy." As if on cue, Veronica entered the sunroom, phone in hand. "My sister wants to come by," she said quietly. "She heard things." Ethan stiffened. "No." Veronica flinched. "I didn't say yes." Grace rose smoothly. "This isn't about visitors," she said gently. "It's about containment." Veronica frowned. "Containment." "Protecting the boys' sense of safety," Grace explained. "Their bodies are doing hard work. Attention can feel like pressure." Veronica nodded slowly, absorbing it. Then the unexpected happened. Liam screamed. Not a cry. A scream, sharp, panicked, full of overload. Ethan's heart slammed into his ribs. He rushed forward instinctively, scooping Liam up. Liam stiffened violently in his arms, his body locking, breath caught. Grace moved quickly but calmly. "Ethan, put him down." "What?" Ethan snapped, fear overriding reason. "Now," Grace said firmly. Ethan froze, torn between instinct and trust. "Slowly," Grace coached. "Back to the mat." Ethan lowered Liam, his hands shaking. The moment Liam's body touched the mat, the tension shifted, still present, but less explosive. Grace knelt beside him, lowering her voice. Too much came in all at once. She hummed. Liam's scream fractured into sobs, then gasps, then uneven breaths. Noah watched, frozen, his own body tensing in sympathy. Grace extended one hand, not touching, just near. "You're safe." Minutes passed. Ethan's chest burned. He felt like he'd failed a test he didn't understand. Eventually, Liam's body softened. He lay exhausted, eyes closed. Grace turned to Ethan, her gaze kind but serious. "This is what pressure looks like." Ethan nodded slowly. "I did this." Grace didn't argue. "We all do it at first." That afternoon, Ethan made the call himself. He contacted the Foundation, his voice calm but unyielding. There will be no observation, no documentation, no discussion. Not now. When he hung up, his hands were steady. That evening, Veronica sat with Grace in the kitchen while the boys napped. "I hate how quickly people want to turn this into a story," Veronica said bitterly. "Like it belongs to them." Grace nodded. "People are uncomfortable with slow things. They want proof." "And what do you want?" Veronica asked. Grace considered. "I want the boys to know their bodies are not performances." The next day brought another test. A news van idled at the end of the long drive. Ethan saw it from the upstairs window, his stomach dropping. "How?" he muttered. Margaret entered, flustered. Someone tipped them off. "They're asking for comment." Ethan didn't hesitate. "Security." "No." But the damage was already done. The boys sensed it before the van was fully turned away. Noah grew quiet, his body heavy and withdrawn. Liam refused to engage at all, his muscles slack, eyes distant. Grace knelt with them, her movements slower than ever. "We're going back," she said softly. "Not backward. Deeper." Ethan frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," Grace said, "that forward doesn't always look like more. Sometimes it looks like less." She canceled the day's planned activities. No mat. No exercises. No exploration. Instead, she sat with the boys on the couch, holding space, humming softly while they leaned against her and Ethan on either side. No goals. No expectations. Just safety. By evening, Noah's fingers twitched again. By nightfall, Liam shifted, pressing his foot faintly against the cushion. Tiny movements. Fragile. But still there. That night, Ethan stood alone outside, staring at the darkened road where the van had been. He realized something that frightened him more than the early days of uncertainty. The world would not leave them alone. If his sons continued to progress, even slowly, people would want access, answers, narratives. He would have to choose. Between control and protection. Between exposure and safety. Between being proud and being quiet. Inside, Grace prepared to leave, gathering her bag. Ethan stopped her at the door. "I don't know how long I can keep this away from them," he admitted. Grace met his gaze steadily. "You don't have to keep it away forever." "When then?" he asked. "When the boys can decide for themselves," she said. "Until then, your job is to be the wall." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of that responsibility settle onto his shoulders. After Grace left, Ethan checked on the boys one last time. Liam slept deeply, his face relaxed. Noah stirred, his leg bending slightly before stilling again. Despite the noise, the pressure, the intrusion, their bodies remembered. The world had pressed in hard that day. But inside Hawthorne Ridge, something quieter had held. And for now, that was enough. By the following week, the outside world had retreated, but not because it had lost interest. It had simply learned patience. Ethan felt it in the pauses between emails, in the sudden politeness of unanswered calls, in the way people who had never cared about his private life now pretended they always had. Attention didn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it waited, smiling. Grace noticed it too. "The danger isn't pressure anymore," she said one morning as they watched the boys nap. "It's temptation." Ethan glanced at her. Temptation. To rush. To prove. To believe that what's fragile can survive being displayed. He nodded slowly. He understood that language now. That same afternoon, Dr. Chen returned, unannounced. She stood in the foyer, coat still on, expression tight with concern. "I need to talk to you," she said quietly. Ethan led her into the study. "I'm worried," Dr. Chen began. "Not about the boy's progress, but about the way it's happening." Ethan stiffened. "You saw it yourself." "I did," she agreed. "And that's why I'm concerned. This kind of self-initiated neurological engagement is rare. People will want to replicate it, study it, and—" Ethan asked. "And they'll want to accelerate it," she said. "Acceleration is where things break." Ethan leaned back, exhaling. "So what are you saying?" Dr. Chen hesitated. "There's a research group in Boston. Pediatric neuroplasticity. They heard about the boys through indirect channels." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Of course they did. They're offering resources," she continued. "Funding. Equipment. A team. And control," Ethan said flatly. Dr. Chen didn't deny it. "They'd want observation rights." Ethan stood. "No." Dr. Chen sighed. "Ethan, this could help them walk sooner." That word hit like a blow. "Walk." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Grace, who had been standing quietly near the door, spoke. "Or it could teach them that their bodies only matter when they perform." Dr. Chen turned, startled. "You must be Grace." Grace nodded. "I am." Dr. Chen studied her. "With respect, you're not trained in neurology." Grace met her gaze steadily. "With respect, neither are the boys' nervous systems. They don't know what's supposed to happen. Only what feels safe." Silence filled the room. Dr. Chen looked between them. "You're gambling." Grace shook her head. "No. Gambling assumes chance. This is trust." That evening, Ethan sat alone in the nursery long after the lights dimmed. Liam and Noah slept peacefully, their bodies loose, unguarded. He realized something uncomfortable. Part of him wanted to say yes. Not because of greed. Not because of ego. But because he was tired. Tired of waiting. Tired of uncertainty. Tired of slow. The research teams offer whispered promises, faster milestones, clearer answers, certainty. Fear didn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looked like opportunity. The next morning, Grace arrived to find Ethan already in the playroom, pacing. "They offered help," he said without preamble. Grace nodded. "I expected that. They think they can make this faster." Grace tilted her head. "Can they?" "Maybe," Ethan admitted. Grace waited. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "What if I'm wrong? What if protecting them means holding them back?" Grace considered him carefully. "Ask yourself this," she said gently. "Are they struggling because they can't move, or because they're afraid to try?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. Grace continued, "Speed doesn't heal fear. Safety does." As if sensing the tension, Noah grew restless, his body stiffening slightly. Liam mirrored him, muscles tightening. Grace knelt instantly. "Something's off." Ethan swallowed. "It's me." Grace nodded. "Then sit." He did. Grace lowered her voice, humming softly. Noah's breathing slowed. Liam's shoulders relaxed. After several minutes, Noah shifted forward unexpectedly. His weight tipped. His hands pressed into the mat. He didn't freeze this time. He held himself there, arms shaking, legs engaged, body suspended between effort and balance. Ethan's heart thundered. Grace whispered, "You've got it." Noah stayed there. 5 seconds. 10. Then gently lowered himself back. Ethan covered his mouth, tears spilling freely. He did that, Ethan choked. He did that without anyone pushing him. Grace smiled softly. Yes. That night, Ethan called the research group himself. Thank you for your interest, he said calmly. But we won't be participating. There was surprise on the other end. Disappointment. Persuasion. Ethan listened patiently, then repeated, No. When he hung up, the house felt lighter. Days passed. Progress returned, slow, deliberate, unmistakable. Liam began pressing his feet more consistently, his legs engaging in tandem rather than isolation. Noah experimented with shifting weight, sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding. Grace documented privately, not for charts, but for memory. One afternoon, Veronica joined them unexpectedly. She watched Noah struggle, tip forward, catch himself, then laugh, a sound none of them had heard before. Veronica gasped. Did he just... Grace nodded. Yes. Veronica sank to the floor, sobbing openly. I didn't think he'd ever laugh like that. Grace placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. He always could. As winter loosened its grip, the snow around Hawthorne Ridge began to melt, revealing patches of earth beneath. Change didn't arrive all at once. It revealed itself gradually. Like strength. Like trust. Like courage. On the last day of the week, Ethan stood by the window as Grace prepared to leave. I almost said yes, he admitted quietly. Grace met his gaze. You still chose them. Ethan nodded. I think I finally understand something. What's that? She asked. He looked toward the playroom, where Liam lay on the mat, his foot pressing steadily against the floor, muscles engaged. Walking isn't the goal, Ethan said. Living without fear is. Grace smiled, not triumphant, not relieved. Just present. Upstairs, Noah shifted forward again, holding himself up just a little longer this time. Not because anyone asked him to, but because, for the first time in his life, his body believed it could. And belief, Ethan was learning, was the strongest muscle of all. Spring arrived quietly at Hawthorne Ridge. Not with celebration or ceremony, but with subtle changes, the snow retreating from the edges of the drive, the pond cracking open in thin silver lines, sunlight lingering longer in the afternoons. The house seemed to breathe differently, as if it had learned a new rhythm. So had the boys. Grace felt it the moment she walked into the playroom one Tuesday morning. The air carried a tension that wasn't fear and wasn't excitement. It was readiness. Today feels full, she murmured. Ethan, sitting nearby with his coffee untouched, nodded. Like something's waiting. Grace smiled faintly. Exactly. She moved through the morning routine with extra care, aware that readiness was fragile. Liam was alert, his gaze steady. Noah seemed restless, his body shifting even before Grace settled him onto the mat. Grace didn't introduce anything new. She didn't need to. She sat cross-legged on the floor, placing herself slightly behind Noah, not supporting him, not positioning him, just present. You can explore, she said softly. Noah leaned forward, hands pressing into the mat. His arms shook as he lifted his chest higher than usual, his knees tucked beneath him. He held there, breathing hard. Ethan's heart pounded so loudly he was sure the boys could hear it. Grace glanced at him, not to warn, but to remind. He forced himself to stay still. Noah rocked slightly, shifting his weight. His foot slid forward unexpectedly, finding traction. Grace's breath caught. Noah froze. The room went utterly silent. Then, without ceremony, without warning, Noah pushed. It wasn't a stand. It wasn't a walk. It was a step. One foot lifted, moved forward, and landed, clumsy, unbalanced, but real. No one spoke. No one cheered. Grace didn't move. Ethan couldn't breathe. Noah wobbled, his arms flailing briefly before his hands slapped back onto the mat. He landed safely, unharmed, eyes wide with shock. Then he laughed. A loud, startled laugh, pure and astonished. Ethan collapsed onto his knees, sobbing. Grace finally exhaled. That, she whispered, was yours. Noah turned his head toward her, still laughing, as if amazed by his own body. Liam stared at his brother like he'd just seen magic. For a long moment, The room existed outside of time. Then Grace gently placed her hand on the mat, not on Noah, not on Ethan. "We stop here," she said quietly. Ethan nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Yes. Yes." They didn't try again that day. They didn't need to. The rest of the morning passed in calm silence. The boys rested, their bodies tired but content. Word did not spread. Not because Ethan hid it, but because he didn't announce it. That afternoon, Veronica found Ethan in the study, staring out the window with a distant expression. "You look like someone died," she said softly. Ethan laughed weakly. "It feels like someone was born." She frowned, then followed his gaze. "What happened?" Ethan turned to her, eyes shining. "Noah took a step." Veronica froze. "A step?" "One," Ethan nodded. "Just one." Her hand flew to her mouth. She sank into the chair, shaking. "Did anyone see?" "Yes," Ethan said gently. "And no." She laughed through tears. "I don't understand." Ethan smiled. Neither did he. That evening, Grace lingered longer than usual, sitting with the boys as dusk settled. Liam was restless, his frustration visible. Grace knelt beside him. "You saw something big today." Liam made a low sound, his body tensing. Grace nodded. "It's okay to want it." She didn't promise his turn. She didn't encourage him to try. She simply sat. Liam's leg pressed hard against the mat, his knee bending higher than ever before. His foot slid forward, then back. He growled in frustration. Grace leaned closer. "Trying is not failing." Liam's breathing slowed. He pressed again. Not a step, but closer. Later that night, Ethan stood outside the nursery, listening to his son's sleep. He realized something profound. The miracle he had begged for wasn't a single moment. It was the accumulation of uncelebrated ones. Days later, Dr. Chen called. "I heard something," she said carefully. Ethan didn't deny it. "Yes. Was it?" "One step," Ethan confirmed. There was silence on the line. "That changes things," Dr. Chen said softly. Ethan nodded, though she couldn't see him. "It changes how we proceed. Not what we value." Dr. Chen sighed. "I understand." When he hung up, Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Not certainty. Acceptance. Grace noticed it the next morning. "You're lighter," she said. Ethan smiled. "I'm not chasing it anymore." Grace nodded. "Good. That's when it grows." Spring continued to unfold. Noah did not walk the next day, or the day after, but the step remained. Not as pressure, as possibility. Liam's progress continued too, subtle, steady, driven by curiosity rather than comparison. One afternoon, as Grace prepared to leave, she paused in the doorway. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "some moments aren't meant to be shared widely." Ethan nodded. "I know." Grace smiled. "But they still change the world." Ethan looked back at the playroom, where Noah sat, leaning forward, hands on the mat, his foot shifting experimentally. One step had happened, and because no one had demanded another, it would happen again, just not on anyone else's schedule. In the quiet of Hawthorne Ridge, where no cameras waited and no applause echoed, the future continued to take shape. Slowly, bravely, one unannounced step at a time. Summer arrived without permission. It came in early light and open windows, in the sound of birds reclaiming the grounds around Hawthorne Ridge, in the way the house finally stopped holding its breath. The season didn't announce a victory. It offered continuity. And that, Ethan realized, was the greatest gift of all. Noah did not wake up walking. Neither did Liam. There was no dramatic morning where the boys stood and crossed the room while sunlight poured in just right. There were no tears of disbelief, no triumphant calls to doctors, no headlines waiting beyond the gates. Instead, there were days. Ordinary, unremarkable days. Days where Noah took 2 steps and then refused a third. Days where Liam surprised everyone by pushing himself upright and then laughed at his own frustration. Days where nothing visible happened at all, except patience grew stronger than fear. Grace continued her work quietly, unchanged by what had already happened. She never referenced the step unless Noah brought it back to his body himself. She never counted, never measured, never compared. She treated progress the way one treats a shy animal, by not chasing it. One afternoon in late June, Ethan sat on the grass with the boys beneath the shade of a wide oak tree. The estate behind them felt less like a fortress now and more like a home that had learned how to soften. Liam lay beside him, propped on his elbows, watching ants march across the earth. Noah sat upright nearby, hands resting on his knees, rocking slightly as if listening to an internal rhythm. Grace sat a few feet away, shoes off, her attention loose but attentive. Noah leaned forward. Ethan felt it before he saw it, the shift in air, the subtle recalibration of space. He did not move. He did not speak. Noah planted his foot. Then the other. He stood. Just for a moment. Long enough for his body to register what it had done. Then he sat back down abruptly, laughing breathlessly, eyes wide with wonder. Grace smiled but said nothing. Ethan pressed his hand into the grass to steady himself. That evening, Veronica cooked dinner for the first time in years. Not because she had to. Because she wanted to. The kitchen filled with warmth and unfamiliar clatter, the smell of something imperfect but real. She hummed softly to herself, glancing at the boys every few seconds as if afraid the moment might dissolve if she looked away too long. At the table, Liam banged his spoon in protest, frustrated by his inability to reach the bowl the way he wanted. Veronica hesitated, then stopped herself from intervening. Liam adjusted. Shifted. Pressed. He managed it. Veronica laughed out loud, then covered her mouth, tears spilling freely. "I missed so much," she whispered. Ethan squeezed her hand. "You're here now." Grace noticed something else in those weeks. She noticed that the boys no longer watched adults for permission before trying. They watched the world instead. One morning, as Grace prepared to leave, Liam surprised everyone by pushing himself to his knees beside the couch, gripping the cushion for balance. His arms shook. His jaw clenched. Ethan rose instinctively, then stopped. Grace stayed seated. Liam wobbled. Nearly fell. Then steadied himself. Grace spoke softly. "You found it." Liam beamed. He did not stand that day. But he slept like someone who had climbed a mountain. Late one evening, Ethan found Grace in the sunroom, standing alone and staring out at the darkening sky. "You're leaving soon," he said. Grace nodded. "My work here is changing." Ethan's chest tightened. "Changing how?" "They don't need me the same way anymore," she said gently. "And that's how it's supposed to be." He swallowed. "I don't know how to thank you." Grace turned to him fully. "You already did." He shook his head. "You gave my sons their bodies back." Grace smiled softly. "No. I helped them feel safe enough to claim them." Silence stretched between them, comfortable and full. "You know," Ethan said after a moment, "I used to think success was about control." Grace nodded. "Most people do." "I was wrong," he continued. "It's about restraint. About knowing when not to interfere." Grace's eyes warmed. That lesson will carry them farther than walking ever could. On Grace's last official day, there was no farewell ceremony. No gifts. No speeches. She knelt in the playroom one last time, sitting quietly with the boys as they explored movement in their own way. Noah stood briefly, then sat. Liam rocked forward, pushing, adjusting, learning. Grace watched, not as a guide, but as a witness. When it was time to go, she stood and slung her bag over her shoulder. Noah reached for her. Not standing. Not stepping. Reaching. Grace knelt and let him wrap his arms around her neck. Liam followed, pressing close. Grace closed her eyes. "Thank you," Veronica said softly from the doorway. Grace smiled. "They did the hard part." Ethan walked Grace to the door. "Will we see you again?" he asked. Grace paused. "Maybe. But you won't need me the way you think." She stepped outside into the late afternoon sun, the door closing gently behind her. Inside, the house felt different again. Not empty. Complete. Weeks later, Ethan stood by the window as Noah crossed the room, slowly, unevenly, arms outstretched for balance. Liam followed behind in his chair, laughing, urging his brother forward. No one clapped. No one filmed. Ethan simply watched. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it was theirs. And that, he finally understood, was the real miracle. Not that the billionaire's twins learned to walk, but that, in a house once ruled by fear and force, they learned how to move forward freely. One step, then another, into a life that belonged to them. Noun said step at a time. If this story touched your heart, you're not alone. Stories like this are told for those quiet moments we all carry, about hope, patience, love, and the strength we don't always see at first. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful, emotional stories that remind us that miracles don't always arrive loudly, that healing takes time, and that love, when given space, can change everything. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Like and share to help these stories reach someone who may need them today. Thank you for listening, for feeling, and for being part of this community. Your support keeps these stories alive.